Xplorite is an upcoming indie Metroidvania title that very recently launched a Steam demo, and I decided to give it a go. I already had the game on my wish list based on the trailers and screenshots I had seen, so I went in with high expectations. So did the demo deliver? Stick around for this review to find out. Overall, I came away very impressed with Xplorite, and it absolutely lived up to the hype that the trailers and screenshots generated when I saw them. I am optimistic that this will end up being a remarkably strong title that sits among some of the true classics of the Metroidvania genre. Was the demo a perfect experience? No, it certainly was not, but the fundamental core of the game is extremely strong, and the issues I encountered are all easily correctable as development continues towards eventual release. So with all of that said, let's get into my specific thoughts and impressions of the demo. Right off the bat, the first thing that jumps out about this game is the look. The visual design is phenomenal and each room oozes with life and detail. Meticulous attention was paid to creating dynamic foregrounds, midgrounds, and backgrounds, including effective repeated use of parallax scrolling. I especially noticed that the save rooms were consistently stunning works of virtuosic art. Countless breakable structures litter the environments and add a sense of the world being a malleable and living entity. Rather than disappearing in a puff of smoke, defeated robot enemies leave their broken remains on the ground. On the whole, I was constantly impressed by how much detail was packed into every aspect of the world. The 3 biomes available in the demo are distinct and vibrant, with none falling short of another in terms of design or craftsmanship. The lighting fluctuations throughout each room masterfully guide the player's perspective during traversal and adds a profound amount of realism to an alien and unfamiliar world. Further, regarding the lighting and effects, I particularly enjoyed the burst effects and particles that trigger when damage was dealt, be it to an enemy or to the player. One other detail I constantly enjoyed was the glow emanating from each doorway. It's a minor touch, but I loved it. Lastly, I acknowledge that not everyone is a fan of screen shake, but I think that turning it off for this game would be a tremendous disservice to how well it is implemented and how much visual impact it adds to combat. Overall, it's hard to overstate just how incredible the visual design is throughout the entire demo. The countless little details that have been poured into the game provide a phenomenal visual experience for the player. Massive credit to what appears to be a small indie design team for punching far above their weight class in this aspect. The quality here rivals even the legends of the Metroidvania genre and the 2D side-scroller genre as a whole. Moving on to audio, and the sound effects and overall sound design are exceptional here, though there were some issues with the music and mixing. 100% of my playtime with the demo was done with earbuds, and I would highly recommend headphones, earbuds, or a nice surround sound system for this one. It is clear based on my experience that a tremendous amount of effort and thought went into creating as immersive of a listening experience as possible. Across the board, sound effects are panned with great intentionality, which if you're not familiar with the term panning, it basically means that sounds to the left occur primarily in the left ear and sounds to the right occur primarily in the right ear, with the magnitude of the shift being determined by how close or distant the sound is relative to the playable character's current position. In this game, panning is crafted such that you really feel like you are present exactly where the player character is in an environment, and that you are actually experiencing sounds from the character's perspective. Noises that visually would be expected to occur to the right of the player are more pronounced in the right ear and vice versa. A boatload of different sound effects are present throughout the game, and they are all of very high quality. One thing I noticed very quickly during my fight with what I call the sentry drone is that if you pay attention to the subtle differences in its sound effects, you can predict what it is about to do in terms of movement and attack. This is just one specific example within what was overall a wonderful experience with the design of the sound effects throughout the game. My only complaint on this topic is that there are rooms in Overgrown Passage where there are several shooting enemies present at the same time, and their shooting noise is unreasonably loud and it's frankly jarringly obnoxious. In terms of music, I would consider it to be more of a mixed bag, though I will admit that this is a very subjective opinion. I adored the music of the surface biome as well as that of the save rooms, both of which gave me visions of Super Metroid with their perfect moody ambiance, which is basically as high of praise as I can give, since Super Metroid is the pinnacle of Metroidvania music in my mind. On the other hand, I found the music in the Sunken City biome to be tedious and repetitive, and the music in the Overgrown Passage biome was overbearingly loud relative to the rest of the game and just felt like unpleasant noise. Furthermore, the track looping in both the Sunken City biome and the Overgrown Passage biome were improperly made, and both tracks would cut out momentarily before returning to the start of the loop. This was jarring every time it occurred, though it should be able to be easily remedied with a simple edit. In terms of boss music, the worm boss and twin robot boss fight used the same theme, and that track was energetic and very appropriate for the battles. I didn't particularly care for the Sentry Drone boss theme, but it at least had a good, pulsing, upbeat vibe, which makes sense for a boss fight. One final issue I noticed with the music is that if you die during a boss fight, the music fades away and there is a brief moment of silence before you respawn, but then the boss music returns and is residually audible for a brief moment after you respawn in the save room before the save room theme begins playing. This, again, should be a simple fix that I hope the development team makes prior to the launch of the full game. I've talked long enough about visuals and audio, so let's shift now to talking about every Metroidvania's make or break characteristic, which is the gameplay. A Metroidvania can have 10 out of 10 marks in both graphics and sound, but if it falls on its face in terms of gameplay and isn't fun, well, it's a failure of a game. And thankfully in Xplorite's case, the demo was a very enjoyable experience, and I believe there is a lot of reason for optimism about what the full release will be like. Controls are tight and responsive, and I always felt in complete control of the playable character. Directional inputs and button presses immediately trigger responsive actions and feel very natural. Lateral movement speed feels right on the money, not too fast to be unwieldy and not too slow to be tedious during traversal of the world. The game does feature variable jump height depending on how long you hold down the jump button, but I did find it more difficult to manage this than I have in other games. I believe that this is because of how rapidly the vertical ascension occurs when you jump. There just isn't a very large window between when you push the jump button and when the playable character reaches his peak jump height. As such, doing short hops requires a very rapid release of the jump button, and failure to execute this precisely will result in jumping higher than you intended to. The Xplorite demo features a good variety of enemy types, and it felt like I generally was experiencing new enemies regularly throughout my progression through the experience. I would expect that to remain true in the full release of the game as well. One aspect of the enemies that I didn't ever come to a solid conclusion about was how the game determines whether enemies respawn or not. Sometimes I would re-enter a room and be surprised that the enemies were all still dead. Other times I would re-enter a room and expect to waltz through it because I had already cleared the enemies, but then the enemies were alive and kicking again. One thing I did seem to conclude was that saving did not trigger a total respawn of all enemies, as is present in a game like Ender Lilies. The demo featured 3 boss encounters as well as 2 wave rooms in which you'd be temporarily locked in a confined space and need to defeat several waves of enemy groups before the doors would open and allow you to continue progressing. I think that wave rooms were an effective way to incorporate variety into the exploration of the world and to give the player a combat challenge area other than the boss arenas. Compared to a game like Guacamelee, these wave rooms were dramatically less frequent, and I would lean towards utilizing them a little more often and in more creative ways. The Colosseum of Fools in Hollow Knight was an excellent example of how to creatively utilize a combination of terrain and enemy waves to really give an enjoyable combat experience. I'm not saying Xplorite needs to have a dedicated Colosseum like Hollow Knight, or that the wave rooms need to be nearly as difficult as what was present in the Colosseum of Fools, but taking inspiration in terms of creating exciting combat experiences is probably warranted. The 2 wave rooms featured in the Xplorite demo were both very basic and didn't provide much challenge beyond the level of combat experience just by moving throughout the world. Also, a nitpick of mine is that in the first wave room, one of the enemy types is able to crawl on a high ceiling that the player cannot reach. This happened to me in my playthrough, and I had to wait, admittedly for only a brief period of time, for it to climb down lower so that I could reach it with my slash. I don't think that allowing an enemy to move out of reach is a good design choice. In terms of the bosses, all 3 were unique and very fun, though it was strange that each one was progressively easier than its predecessor. The worm boss, which was the first one, was a bit confusing, and based on the game's Steam discussion board, some other players were even more confused than I was. The issue is that the boss initially appears and is impervious to damage. It isn't until it jumps and reveals its red, damageable underside that you can actually make progress against it. However, striking the sides of its body as it moves around the room triggers a visual effect that many players understood to mean that there was some sort of damage being done or progress being made. I quickly determined that damage was not being done, but I still chose to strike the sides of its body repeatedly because it somewhat seemed like I could trigger it to start jumping if I struck the sides enough times. Despite many attempts against the worm boss, I still never landed on a solid conclusion of if striking the sides altered its behavior at all, and given that I am not the only player that found this to be a confusing situation, I think change is warranted. It should be noted that a hotfix was made based on player feedback to make the sound effect of striking the side more obvious that no damage was being dealt, but the visual effect seemingly still remains, and it was the bigger of the 2 problems. The sentry drone boss was a very different style of fight compared to the worm, and the fight against the twin robots was very reminiscent of the brothers Oro and Mato from Hollow Knight, though Xplorite's version was dramatically easier than Oro and Mato were. There is no corpse run mechanic in the demo. If you die, you do lose the currency that you collected since you last saved, but there is no other penalty besides just being teleported back to your most recent save point. Players that are looking for a punishing, Souls-like experience will seemingly not find that in this title. Invisible platforms were present at the very beginning of the game, but then disappeared.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
However, there were a few instances of invisible pitfalls throughout the demo. These pitfalls did not seem to have any visual cue to clue the player into their presence, and they overall were just an annoying nuisance. I would be happy to see both the invisible platforms and the invisible pitfalls be removed from the full game. Dealing with completely unmarked invisible stuff is simply not fun. There is a reason most players groaned and rolled their eyes when they encountered a search party stage in Super Mario Bros. Wonder: Death to Invisible Nonsense. Pogoing off of enemies and spikes is present and is seemingly also mandatory for progression as soon as you enter the Sunken City biome. The second room in that biome has a spike floor that you seemingly cannot cross without pogoing at least once off of the spikes, but the demo never gave any indication that pogoing existed or could be executed on spikes. On the one hand, an experienced Metroidvania player is probably familiar with pogoing and would think to do that to pass the spikes, as I did. But an inexperienced player who is not familiar with the genre may not think of trying that and may get stuck, potentially to the point of just giving up and playing something else. I am happy that pogoing is in the game, but I think if it's going to be mandatory for progression, there should probably be some sort of hint, clue, or outright instruction given to the player so that anyone unfamiliar with the technique can learn it and not hit a roadblock. The game features a module system which is akin to the charm system in Hollow Knight and many other Metroidvania games that have a similar mechanism for equipable buffs. The 3 modules available in the demo were frankly very basic and uninspired. However, the module menu did have many blank spots, so hopefully the modules in the full game are more interesting and fun to use than the 3 available in the demo. In terms of permanent abilities, there were technically 4, but realistically only 2 that were shown in the demo. The first 2 were just the basic functions of being able to slash to attack and being able to heal. The final 2 were the wall jump ability and the double jump ability. Both of these are standard fare for Metroidvania games. It is worth mentioning that the demo did make reference to gaining access to a gun, though it was not available for use, so the mechanics and attributes of it can only be speculated about at this time. Furthermore, the control scheme featured in the main menu also made reference to buttons for sling, aim, dash, shoot, and something called activate drone suit. None of these buttons were functional for any purpose in the demo, but seeing the control scheme at least provides a glimpse into what mechanics the full game will bring into play. Camera movement is done by holding L1 and moving the left stick. This is extremely clunky and awkward, and camera control would be much better off being controlled by the right stick. Per the official control scheme diagram in-game, right stick is currently unbound, and if that doesn't change in the full release, it's a no-brainer to bind camera control to the right stick. Loading times were extremely quick, lasting no more than about 3 seconds when transitioning between biomes and being even quicker when transitioning from death to respawn. Room transitions were nearly instantaneous. Rob, the playable character's companion, detailed how to unlock the mysterious decode chests, but then there seemingly wasn't any way to know how to actually decode the locks. It doesn't make sense for him to go out of his way to tell you to look around for clues if there aren't actually any clues there. There were several of these chests and seemingly none of them were accessible in the demo. It seems like it would have made more sense for them to be removed from the demo if they were unusable, or at the very least, cut the dialogue in which he sends you on a wild goose chase for no reason. Overgrown Passage featured door trigger switches on wires that I thought were pretty cool. The wires were nice guides to help the player not overlook where the switches were ultimately placed. Without the wires, the switches would have been much easier to overlook and potentially result in player frustration when trying to figure out how to open the locked doors they link to. The version of the demo that I played had a couple of soft locks that were supposedly fixed the same day I played, but after I had finished. The first boss, which was by far the most difficult of the 3 in the demo, was also supposedly nerfed based on player feedback that it was too difficult, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I also don't necessarily disagree with the decision either. There were legitimately dozens of typos and grammatical errors in the game's text and dialogue. I understand that these are seemingly easy to fix, but that aspect of the demo experience definitely gave a very sloppy and unpolished impression. The dev team is apparently aware and will be performing a, quote, grammar check pass on all dialogues, end quote, but in my opinion this should have been done before releasing the demo. It's one thing to have a couple of minor typos, but to have, and I'm not exaggerating, dozens of them is a bad look. I took a screenshot every time I noticed a spelling or grammatical error, and I ended up with 32 screenshots, some of which featured multiple errors. Gotta do better than that as far as I'm concerned. When you access a file in the main menu, there's a toggle box for hints. I did not turn hints on when I created the file I played the demo with, and when I got stuck at the end of the demo, I went back to the main menu and tried to turn on the hints in case they would help me figure out how to stop being stuck. However, the hints toggle box was grayed out for my file, seemingly meaning that you cannot turn hints on once you have started a file. I think it would be wise for the dev team to allow hints to be toggled on and off throughout the life of a file in case players get stuck, like I did. On a related note, the demo does not officially have an endpoint, hence why I eventually felt stuck and thought I was missing something to continue progressing when in reality there was nothing left to do and nowhere left to go. When I played the demo for Akatori, which is another Metroidvania game, it very clearly indicated that the demo was over and I had completed everything that there was to experience. Now, Akatori's demo is definitely structured differently than Xplorite's is, and it was more natural to put in a "you did it" message. However, I still think that there should be a message given to the player in the Xplorite demo that the demo has effectively been completed, even if not every last collectible was obtained. I think triggering a message after beating all 3 bosses would be reasonable, and it could just simply say, "You've completed all of the bosses in the demo. You may have some collectibles left to obtain, and feel free to keep exploring, but the demo is effectively over at this point. Thanks for playing, and let us know what you think."
In conclusion,
overall, the Xplorite demo was very, very impressive. I am very much looking forward to the full release, and I think there is a really good chance that this becomes a classic within the Metroidvania genre. The foundations of the game are excellent, and the issues that I encountered are all either already fixed or can easily be fixed. The dev team is active within the demo feedback thread within the game's Steam community page, and changes are being implemented based on player feedback, so I am optimistic that they are very invested in making the game be the very best that it can be. As such, I expect a very strong final product when the full game launches. I absolutely plan to buy it and play it, and I may even give a follow-up review of the full game here on the channel. Let me know what you think and if that's something you'd be interested in. Based on what I experienced in the demo, if the full game doesn't end up being at least an 8 out of 10 product, I will be both surprised and disappointed, and my hope would be for a product that warrants a 9 out of 10 rating. Anyway, that's all I have for this one. Thank you so much for watching, it really means a lot. If you like indie games, Metroidvanias, 2D side-scrollers, and platformers in general, definitely consider subscribing to the channel. And if you like this video, definitely hit that thumbs up button to let me know. Lastly, if you have anything you want to talk about, drop a comment and I'll be happy to talk to you. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, bye-bye.